Welcome to another edition of Black Focus. I'm your host, Ron Edwards, coming to you from the corporate studios of MTN, Minneapolis Television Network. It is a overcast day, if you will, but hey, it's warm. I mean, to the extent. In fact, I think the temperatures are in the mid 30s or even higher. By the way, though, it's real slick out there. For those of you that haven't necessarily been out walking around, and it's a little bit beyond 2:30, if you will, Central Daylight Saving Time. See, since we were last with you, we went to Daylight Savings Time. But be careful out there because the sidewalks and portions of different streets are extremely slippery and et cetera. And I've been kind of watching a lot of people falling, if you will. It's not a very pleasant thing. We have a two-part piece that we're going to be doing this afternoon, looking at two high-profile cases involving the police, if you will. And yet, in many regards, many respects, they are on a different plateau. Someone here at studio said this will be an interesting test of this, if this is how the police will be dealt with in the future in the state of Minnesota. I don't think so. I think that race in both cases has a tremendous amount to do with how the system would work. But as we have done for 6 years on this program, we have followed closely the tragic death of Terrence Franklin, if you will, in a basement in a home on Bryant Avenue, wasn't it, in South Minneapolis. We will be looking at that as part two, Terrence Franklin, if you will. By the way, very quickly, impeachment, if you will. A lot of conversation going on. Yesterday, a majority House Speaker Nancy Pelosi of California, Democrat San Francisco, talked in terms that they will have to wait before they begin the movement of impeachment against the current sitting president of the United States until the Mueller report is made available. Our position is that's going to be interesting. Taxpayers of the United States are paying for the report, but we will not get an opportunity to know all of that the report, the Mueller report, contains. First of all, the Attorney General of the United States, Mr. Barr, has indicated that he is authorized under color of law. Only the United States Supreme Court can really determine that argument, but it's a stall tactic, because one of the things that you do not want and you will not see happen is an impeachment process in an election year, 2020. By the time that the United States House of Representatives gets through with the bill of particulars, the articles of high crimes and misdemeanors and et cetera, we will have been through 2019. You can rest assured of that. And clearly the Congress will have no taste whatsoever, no matter how volatile the relationship between the two parties and Americans will be. There will be no attempt to begin impeachment processes, which means we will go through the election of 2020. Unless something happens to Donald Trump will certainly be the candidate, be he with or without the endorsement of the Republican Party, if you will. So for all those people speculating that the endorsement will be denied him probably sometime in June or July at the Republican National Convention, that don't make no difference. He's still the sitting president, and he is not and cannot be stopped for running for a second term. So we watch all of that. We watch the jumping up and down. The newer Democrats, if you will, the millennium, really don't understand how the ball game really works. That's what's gotten Representative Omar into big trouble, if you will. Greatly disappointed with her attack of former President Barack Obama. Her statements, I think, were inappropriate, unnecessary, if you will, and not consistent with the kind of support that Barack Obama gave to the migration, if you will, the immigration, if you will, of Somalis to the United States of America. I would hope that someone would be able to bring a little bit more seasoning to Representative Omar and help her get a better understanding of how the ball game is played in the real arena of life, if you will, the Congress of the United States. So we watch all of that very closely here from our seat, if you will, at MTN. Well, two big trials coming up. One April 1st, if you will, the trial of Mohammed Noor, a Somali national, if you will, police officer in the Minneapolis Police Department involved in the shooting death of a white Australian national in an alley in southwest Minneapolis, if you will, over a year ago, and that will be interesting to watch that. The other will be a even more volatile trial, and that is the trial of the family, the heirs of Terrence Terrell Franklin versus the city of Minneapolis mayor, chief, Pacific officers, and etc., which, by the way, we have seen another change in the date, if you will. 5-6 months ago, it was supposed to take place second week in April. Reliable sources in the federal court system have just confirmed to us about 25 minutes ago, before we came on the air, that the date of the trial involving the death of Terrence Franklin will be October 7th. We repeat that again, will be October 7th, 2019, at the federal, I assume it will be at the federal courthouse, probably in downtown Minneapolis, though it could be very well held at the federal courthouse in downtown St. Paul. It is the choice of the judge, if you will. But we will get into greater detail, specificity, and etc. When we take a look at part two of significant legal maneuvering in a situation in which, in the case of Mr. Franklin, an African American, died at the hands of the police. In the case that will be first up on April 1st, if you will, we have a white female who died at the hands of a black police officer, if you will. And some people say it just like that, just as ugly as that, you know. And so we will be watching him. So let's go to Mohammed Noor. Mohammed Noor's attorneys have handled him with great effectiveness, if you will, respect, and etc., consistent with what one expects should come into play during the course of, quote unquote, the search for justice and fairness and etc. And we certainly hope that the picture is coming across clear to you. We're kind of looking at our screen and we're seeing all kinds of things happening. We hope Big Brother hasn't reached and got us once again. But anyways, we assume that the audio, we see it's back on. We assume that the audio is well. In the case of Mohammed Noor, he will, as we say, go on trial. The first actions that will be initiated by the court will be the selection of a jury. We assume that Mohammed Noor and his attorneys will not ask for what is called a bench trial. Under Anglo-Saxon law, a bench trial is when the judge sits as the sole arbitrator, facilitator, judge, jury, and etc. So we will watch closely, but we assume that this will be a jury trial starting on April 1st, 2019, at the Hennepin County Government Court facility, if you will. Will Mohammed Noor testify? We do not think so, as we have said. In fact, it serves no purpose, particularly if the jury selection process turns out to be all white. In other words, no individuals who represent Mr. Noor's peers, if you will. In other words, people of color, if you will. The failure to have a jury that is not indicative, reflective of, quote unquote, the society in which we all live in will raise serious questions with regards to the fairness of this process. Now, we would expect that the battle as it pertains to the selection of the jury in the case of Muhammad Noor, it should be fierce. His attorneys, who, as we said just minutes ago, have showed tenaciousness, if you will, and compassion and concern for their client, former Minneapolis police officer Muhammad Noor. As you remember, he was fired by Chief Madara Arredondo a couple of months after, quote unquote, the initial indictment. You remember he first was indicted for third-degree murder and manslaughter. But our, quote unquote, great county attorney, Michael Freeman, waited a year and did something very interesting. I was surprised that Noor's attorney, though I'm quite sure this case has run up a heck of a bill, if you will, but I was surprised that Noor's attorneys let Mike Freeman get away with what he did a couple months ago, and that was to upgrade the charges against Officer Noor to second-degree murder. First time, just as it was with the third-degree murder, first time in the history of the state of Minnesota that a law enforcement officer has been charged with third, second, and definitely first-degree murder in the death of a civilian, if you will, irrespective of who that civilian was, Native American, black, white, Asian, or etc. And so, the jury, let's say that it's a jury trial, jury is selected. Let's say that maybe we get surprised as people of color, and we have 1, 2 people of color on the jury for Officer Noor. I doubt if we'll have any Somalis, if you will, on the jury under any circumstances, if you will. The trial will be one that is most interesting. The prosecution, the state as it is referred to, will make their argument first, speaking to the allegations and the charges of second-degree murder and manslaughter by Officer Noor, if you will. His attorneys will then be up next. They will certainly maintain that he was facilitating and carrying out his responsibilities as a peace officer. That is the proper terminology under color of law. As a peace officer, that he was carrying out his responsibilities, etc., when he discharged his weapon one time, killing, quote unquote, Justine Dahman out as she stood outside of the Minneapolis Police Department's SUV patrol car. He fired across his partner who was driving the automobile. They both said that they were startled and etc. And of course, the narrative, if you will, that also includes the theory, if you will, has been bantered back and forth for almost the last couple of years. It will be important on how and what latitude the judge will allow both sides, the prosecution and the defense, in not only their arguments, but even starting with their opening statements. And of course, there is always closing statements, you know, unless there's a call for a mistrial, something happens during the course of the trial, and either side maintains that there has been a mistrial and the judge has to make a ruling. Very rarely, there has to be a very egregious series of actions for a court to allow a mistrial, but we've seen it happen, if you will. How long will the trial last? As we said here just minutes ago, it will depend on the number of witnesses. Now, in the case of the grand jury, and we talked about that a year ago here on this program, Mike Freeman, the county attorney, who just, by the way, is feeling very comfortable. He just won in November last year another term, the 4-year term as county attorney. Mike Freeman called over 50 law enforcement officers, Minneapolis police officers. I don't know if it was like another case that we'll be talking about in about another 30 minutes where they brought in individuals who were there and had a role to play, if you know what I mean. And so it will be interesting. Will the judge indicate, though a judge will not do anything to necessarily prohibit the ability of the two sides, the attorneys for the two sides, to put on their case in chief, if you will, as they say, but you know, you will possibly wear down the jury, Mr. County Attorney, if you put, 60, 70 individuals on the witness stand. But if you do that, then this trial will last almost a month, if you will. Now, people who, are brought in to be a juror in cases dealing with, commercial kinds of things like, pharmaceutical companies and et cetera, they really come to mind. Cases dealing with patent rights and et cetera. I mean, those cases can last 8, 9, 10 months, a couple of years. So the decision by the county attorney, as we speak here in studio at MTN, will be how many folks he will put on the stand. Now, he has already been kind of pushed back by the judge. I was kind of surprised that when the county attorney a couple of weeks ago made the request of the court, petitioned the court, made a motion, actually, proper terminology, a motion to bring in experts to talk in terms of the psychological conditioning, the psychological testing, the psychological observations of Officer Noor, and maybe by extension the other 6 Somali officers. The judge turned that down. She said no, that it was too much out of balance, if you will. There was not going to be any indication that psychological conditioning of Officer Noor is a primary matter, if you will, a matter of significant prima facie, if you will, and et cetera. And I thought, wow, that kind of set prosecution back a little bit. But it will be the responsibility of prosecution to make Muhammad Noor a bad person, a bad human being. They would like to probably use references, statements like savage, if you will, and other kind of reflections. I don't think that this judge is going to allow anything approaching that. She has a reputation of being pretty fair-minded, and et cetera. But there's the dog whistle, particularly if you have an all-white jury. There will be the presence of the dog whistle, if you will, where folks who are of the same persuasion, if you will, the same base, if you will be making statements. I've seen it happen so many times in the many trials that I have covered over the many, many years. Basically more than 60 years, if you will. I went to my first trial when I was 19 years old. It was a case in dealing with an African-American blind man who had been beaten by the police as he was attempting to get on a bus. That case, that gentleman prevailed, by the way. He had a black attorney, blind attorney too, for those of you that can go back that far. And that was Attorney Ward, if you will. Great attorney. This way back 1958. So the prosecution, but if I'm the prosecution, let me just put another hat on, if you will, if I'm from one of the Scandinavian countries. If I have an all-white jury, in the case of Muhammad Noor, and I'm the prosecutor, I fully activate my dog whistle, if you will. I go to great lengths to send the necessary message, to telegraph the necessary message to the jury that this person is a bad person, this person is an animal, this person is not worthy of your compassion. He's certainly not worthy of you determining that in any shape, form, or fashion that Muhammad Noor is innocent, quote unquote, of actions against the interest and the franchise of the deceased and her family. By the way, there's a lawsuit for what, $50 million that has been filed by the family of Justine in Australia against the city of Minneapolis and the taxpayers of Minneapolis and et cetera. How that case, which is a civil case, how that will turn out, how that will be handled, only time will tell, and you can believe a case like that will take another 2 to 3 years. So the Mohammed Noor case will begin to run time-wise a parallel race with the case of Terrence Franklin, who we will be talking about in another 10 or 12 minutes. So Mohammed Noor's attorneys will examine, if you will. They will probably bring in maybe a couple of surprise witnesses who will talk in terms of what happened, but they may not, because here's the problem that everyone has. There were technically only 4, unless the prosecution has a surprise witness, if you will, someone that lived along that alley in that block who happened to be looking out the window, and they would be brought in to testify that they heard statements being made that God is great, if you will, Akbar, Akbar, if you, I mean, you know, but I don't know. I don't know. Now, normally, in preparation for a trial such as this, a high-profile trial, there are, you know, pretrial motions and things like that, and the judge has a pretty good feel for what each side is going to bring in. And so it appears that a significant part of the time in this trial of Mohammed Noor will be spent by the prosecution trying to convince the jury that a guilty plea is in order, if you will. Notice, and later on you'll see what we are doing with regards to the psychological premises that are at hand. And so everyone will watch closely. The preparation will intensify in probably the 10 days before April 1st. And that actually, we're not that far away from it, when the newspapers and others and reporters that are attempting to cover this trial. It is my feeling that it is because of the Mohammed Noor situation that the city of Minneapolis pushed back. Obviously, were granted a continuance by the court, the federal court, which is kind of tough in the case of Terrence Franklin, that has been pushed all the way back from what was originally 8-9 months ago, a date in early April, also about maybe 10 days after the Mohammed Noor trial. But you have to remember that the death of Terrence Franklin, you know, took place like 4.5 years before Mohammed Noor. Mohammed Noor wasn't even on the police department and et cetera. But we want to keep all of this in play because it has a lot to do with how the media, we in the Fourth Estate, will cover this particular these particular trials, actually, where you have just the opposite. In one case, police kill a young black man, blow his head off of his shoulders. In the other case, a black, quote-unquote, Somali officer shoots and kills a blonde Caucasian woman in a dark alley with obviously a mistaken situation. But now let's just talk a little bit about some of the events that night it was always interesting, and we first reported that here at MTN, that it was always interesting what kind of conversation went on between law enforcement officers, and particularly those that may not have been attached or assigned to the homicide unit, with the fiancé. You remember the fiancé? The fiancé was at some kind of conference in New York City. They reached him by phone at his hotel room. That was how the writers for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, the St. Paul Dispatch, Pioneer Press, the Duluth papers and etc. wrote the stories. Fiancé was told that his beloved fiancé had been shot and killed, if you will, behind their home there on the alley in South Minneapolis. Now we began to report here at MTN that some peculiar things had happened that night. There were peculiar statements being made. Some of the neighbors, now this is going to be a problem for Mike Freeman, if you will, and that is if in fact Mohammed Noor's attorneys have talked to any residents who were out there that night after the shot was fired and police descended and all of that. But let me go back to something we kind of touched on but did not finalize, as we probably should have, and that is there were only 4 people in that alley. That goes back to what we were saying about, hopefully, there's not this surprise witness as it pertains to Mohammed Noor, who allegedly, was looking out the back window of their home and saw something altogether different and heard Mohammed Noor screaming and hollering in a foreign tongue, if you will, and et cetera. And there's a reason why we're saying all this, and we reinforce our position at all times. We think through all aspects of what it is that we're talking about. And so in that alley were 4 individuals, 4 human beings, if you will. 3 white, and 1 black, if you will, a black Somali who happened to be a police officer. The 3 whites were the deceased, Officer Noor's partner, if you will, who was driving, who Officer Noor shot across his body, if you will, when he fired, indicating that he was startled, he was scared with regards to the sudden appearance of the deceased. And then there was a young gentleman on a bicycle, if you will. In fact, we shared with you that our sources had indicated that one of the things that had happened with regards to the fact that the squad car had continued to go down the alley and that Justine had to run down the alley at a slow pace and ultimately hit the back of the police car, which some experts will probably testify at trial, that could basically sound like a pistol shot. Now, there was a peculiar set of events here about 2 months ago when initially the attorneys for Mohammed Noor asked that they be allowed to bring in their experts to examine the vehicle that Officer Noor and his partner were riding in that night. And it was kind of surprising when it appeared that the MPD said yes, and then they said no. And then they said, well, we can give you a squad car, but it won't be an SUV like the one that the 2 officers were riding in and that Justine hit with her hand on the back of. And the whole thing fell apart, for those of you that have been following this. And it appears, at least on the record, that there was no examination and that the attorneys for Mohammed Noor were not allowed to access the SUV, that police car, SUV make, that the 2 officers were in and that Justine hit with her hand as she was attempting to get their attention, if you will. Now, in the meanwhile, there are some that say that the officer's attention was drawn away from anybody coming up behind them because of the young Caucasian riding his bike coming up the alley. Now, as we first reported over a year and a half ago, that this was a crucial time in America because an African-American police sergeant in New York City had been shot dead by an African-American gunman who had walked up to the emergency van that she was in. Actually, it was called a control command van, if you will. And the gentleman carrying a long-barreled .38 Smith & Wesson fired from point-blank range. She, a mother of 2, by the way, this African-American sergeant, if you will, well-respected and loved, was killed instantly. Well, what had happened around the country is that at roll call, police officers were being told to be extremely careful on calls that led them into alleys, dark streets, and et cetera, and et cetera. And I think in some regards, and that will come up at trial, why Officer Noor took out his service weapon and actually admitted initially to the investigators that arrived initially that he had it in his lap because they had become concerned with the individual on the bicycle coming apparently towards them, as we understand it. Now, this then takes us further into the evening. Telephone call to the fiancé of Justine in New York City in his hotel room, as we understand it, indicating, and then some now say there were other calls. It will be interesting to see if Mohammed Noor's attorneys have subpoenaed the phone records for any number of officers, about 7, who were at the scene. Well, they weren't at the scene of the shooting. They arrived like everybody else after the shooting. But what kind of calls they made, and who was it that made the call to the fiancé, a second, third, fourth call, in which conversations, according to the scuttlebutt, even in the 5th precinct, if you will, in which Officer Noor was assigned to, along with one other Somali officer, that statements were made that had to do with Officer Noor's race, Officer Noor's ethnicity, if you will, Officer Noor's training, and et cetera. And then within a short period of time, a couple days later, some of these same officers that were there that night, bad-mouthing their colleague, were involved in making a trans-Pacific long-distance call to, first of all, the newspapers in Melbourne and Sydney and Perth, Australia, Brisbane, large papers in those countries. And ultimately someone was able to get through to the Prime Minister, the chief executive, if you will, of this British Commonwealth nation called Australia. And someone fed him information, outrageous comments, and et cetera, about Officer Noor and the few Somali officers in that department. At that time, I think there were 8. They're down to 6 now. And the Prime Minister, who then repeated, though he would not identify who had provided him with this information, he didn't know anything about Minneapolis. He didn't know anything about the training protocol for the Minneapolis Police Department, the training demands and obligations in the state of Minnesota, et cetera. But he began to make statements. The Prime Minister, Turnbull, began to make observations about the quality of the human character, as well as the professional training or absence of professional training of Somali officers. And then it really got good because by October of that year, in little bars out in the suburbs and et cetera, where some of these white officers hang out, they were talking about that all of the jungle bunnies, all the Negroes, they used the other word, were unqualified and et cetera, if you will. And then, that then led to questions about the quality and the integrity and the proficiency of the chief of police, if you will, and that he had promoted too many Negroes, if you will. All this kind of conversation had been going on. And one of the things that, depending on how tenacious Officer Noor's attorneys had been, is that information like this started being discussed, quote unquote, in Government House there in Australia, if you will. The equivalency, they call it Government House there in Australia, the equivalency to the White House here in the United States of America, that Australian government officials were talking in terms of these individuals who had no business being law enforcement, being constables, as they call them in most of the British Commonwealth countries, if you will, which Australia is. And we talked about that here on these programs for a number of months, of how maligned Somali officers, and then it had grown and latched on to black American officers and et cetera, though none of them would really stand up and say what it is they were hearing, except one Somali officer. We talked about that. So for those that on demand and et cetera, that program is still here in the archives of the MTN. There was a Somali officer who in fact was on duty that night. And we first exclusively reported that here when nobody else would touch it, who was on duty that night. And like we said, there were only 2 Somali officers in that precinct, the 5th precinct, who, when the call came through, officer needs assistance, shots had been fired, etc. He called, it indicated he was en route. Now, he was at the far north end of the 5th precinct. He was up around Uptown in that area, closer to downtown. And he received a interesting command, an order, that he not come. Yes, this Somali officer, the 2nd officer in the precinct, not the 2nd officer at the scene or et cetera, because that officer, respected and decorated, if you will, and a man who carries a deep feeling of hurt and betrayal, as we speak tonight, was told, don't come. You are to stand down, if you will. Later, he began to receive threats at the precinct, at the 5th precinct, if you will. In the training room, if you will, things were being written on the whiteboard about Somalis and what kind of people they were, and about Somali officers and etc. People were stunned that the thin blue line was not holding when it came to officers of color. But then black American officers in the Minneapolis Police Department, and I now refer you to the legendary case and the settlement of $750,000 by the Mill City Five, which included the current chief of the department, Madera Arredondo, Officer Commander Charles Adams, and Lieutenant Hamilton, if you will, former Deputy Chief Harris, and former Inspector Edwards. No relation, have since been forced into retirement, if you will. And so no one has been able to explain, and I don't know, and we're going to go into the final 15 minutes with the circumstances surrounding the death of Mr. Franklin. I don't know if this officer is going to be called, this Somali officer who was so bastardized, if you will, so insulted, if you will, so I stand accused kind of situation, that he had no relationship with anybody really in the 5th precinct. And I will throw out 2 names of 2 officers that you officers know fully about this. Officer Danny May, if you will, and Officer Barnett, white female, works with the CERT team and etc. We well remember her holding guns to our heads in the Elks Lodge, if you will, when the police made a mistake and stormed into the Elks a number of years ago, put 9 African Americans, senior citizens, on the floor, threatened to bollard, and boy, they called us everything. I thought my name was, Black SOB and etc. So anyways, people, they are preparing. We know that reporters are watching and preparing to write a couple of pieces before April the 1st, and that's not that far off. We find it interesting. But I want you to keep in mind that Somali officer that we have just revealed to you, that no one wanted to talk about, that his circumstances have been suppressed and obstructed and etc., who was told that night. He was the watch officer that particular night. He was like, car 7 in the 5th precinct and etc. He was a man who prided himself on being loyal to the MPD, a loyal police officer, a courageous man. Who was it, and for what reason and purpose, and where is the documentation that this officer, this Somali officer, see, we're not going to tell his name. We want someone to challenge us, to say that it didn't happen, if you will. But why was it that this Somali officer, the only other officer along with Mohammed Noor in the 5th Precinct in South Minneapolis, why was he told, stand down, do not respond? We do not want you at the scene. Because people had already been poisoning the minds of the white citizens and friends, if you will, of Justine. And they were already talking about these black SOBs and etc. Calls were already being made, and it was to be amplified even more in closing on this particular part by white officers who were sophisticated enough to make calls to Government House in Australia and to even speak to people close to the Prime Minister and to provide them with false information about the quality, the integrity, and quote unquote, the trust of Somali officers. And as we said just a couple minutes ago, enhancing that to talk about all of the blackies, if you will, to all of the blacks, including the chief and etc. Got a problem, my friends. We don't know politically, as well as they have handled Mohammed Noor's defense up to this particular minute. We just don't know if those white attorneys have the commitment to call that Somali officer to testify on behalf of his fellow police officer who happens just to be Somali, to talk about the kind of treatment that he received. Because see, if you get into the treatment that that Somali officer received following the shooting of Justine, then you get a better understanding of what Mr. Edwards is saying about the racism, the disdain, and the hatred displayed by some white officers against their own fellow police officers as a part of the thin blue line, if you will. It happened, my friends. I challenge the county attorney to say that it didn't. And I also challenge the attorneys of Mohammed Noor to make a decision to put that Somali officer on the stand and make the city of Minneapolis provide the information and documentation with regards to what it was that made that and who made that call for him to stand down and not come to the scene, if you will. The second case, and as we said just about an hour ago, we were not totally surprised that in the matter, and let me do this on this one, in the matter of Terrence Franklin, young African American, it's been 6 years, my friend. I mean, boy, the wheels of justice grind. But I'm going to take a document here from the files. These files are you see how thick they are. I'm going to hold them up. But these are files that came into our possession a year ago from the attorneys of Mr. Franklin. This document here, for all the naysayers and etc., this document is the final motion, the final draft, the final argument made to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court. For a trial now that will start on October 7th. They've been pushing it back. And as I said to you earlier, I understand clearly why it's being pushed back, because they could not afford to have two trials like this in the same city, though in different legal and judicial jurisdictions. One the state, the other one, this one, Terrence Franklin, a young black man, brutally beaten, if you will, his testicles torn from the lower part of his body by a police dog, Nash. Many of y'all probably don't even remember the dog's name, but we do, because we have the documents here, if you will. And then Mr. Franklin having a MP5 submachine gun put up right here to the side of his face. And all of this here, and part of his eye, and etc., was all blown away. The little room that they took him into to execute him, if you will, those two police officers, if you will, and then the third individual who was not a police officer, but who was a member of the Department of Corrections. He's in this document for all of those. We always refer to him as DOC David. And there are many of you out there in the county attorney's office, in the police department, in the legal world, and etc., who know just who we're talking about. It was you, DOC David, an employee of the Department of Corrections of the state of Minnesota. It was you who took Terrence Franklin's DNA and put it on the barrel of that MP5 submachine gun to make it appear that this young African-American had attempted to struggle, and in fact had actually, at one point, according to David Chinnon, writing for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune 6 years ago, had actually wrestled control of the gun and had opened fire and had wounded 2 officers before the officers somewhere or another gained re-control of the gun, and Terrence Franklin had most of his head blown away. This is the United States Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit, later presented and upheld by the United States Supreme Court. It took the United States Supreme Court to finally order and confirm, first, the decision of the trial judge, the decision of a 3-member panel of the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, and then a request predicated on arrogance by the city of Minneapolis to demand, though under color of law they had a right to do it, as we move into, the last 12, 13 minutes. They had the right to do it, but when you play that game with the court system, judges do not like to be put in a position of assessing the quality of work of their colleagues. But the city of Minneapolis, so desperate to cover up the murder of Terrence Franklin, and it's the reason that it has now been for the supporters and friends and loved ones of Terrence Franklin. The trial has now been pushed back to the 7th of October of this year. But we understand, as the only news entity 6 years ago, at the time of his brutal death, that talked to you and wrote in the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder and spoke on these programs here at MTN of what really happened in that basement, as that dog, first of all, the sergeant, if you will, who confirms, Sergeant Strauss, if you will, confirms in this document here that he punched with his fists and he hit with one of those long flashlights and beat Terrence Franklin as the dog, Nash, big 75-pound baby, big boy, big dog, had bitten a lot of Negroes, if you will. You know, we have a history in this town of putting dogs on folks, and they do some serious damage to you if they catch you in the right places. In the case of Mr. Franklin, they caught him in his lower groin, in the area of his testicles, and they tore his testicles apart. So he was never, and it says it in this document here. Document filed with the United States Supreme Court. Ain't nothing that we making up here that no black man is making up sitting in a studio in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The documentation is here, my friends. Additional documentation. Let's just do this here. You know, let's just bring out the other documents, if you will. The document provided and preparing, quote unquote, all the people that were and now going to have to go to trial on October 7th of this year. Got to go to trial. But this one was the key, because this is where the appellate firm, the firm that does appeals, if you will, located in Washington, D.C., just for those that want to ask the question and need to know, at 345 Union Plaza, if you will, and then they have offices here in Minneapolis at 333 Washington Avenue, if you will. Top-notch firm that does appeals, if you will. And they put together for the Patton law firm. Michael Patton is the attorney of record on behalf of the father and the heirs of Terrence Franklin. His father, Walter Lewis Franklin II, is a brave man. He's a tenacious man. He has stayed the course 6 years, my friend, 6 years. The city of Minneapolis fought this case every step of the way, and finally they thought that they had a victory with a court that had turned conservative, and they appealed the refusal of the full 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, all 9 members of the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, who said that this must go to trial. You know, stop doing this, if you will. The 8th Circuit Court, which part-time sits over in St. Paul. Their original home is St. Louis, Missouri, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, but they also hear cases here in St. Paul. They said to the city of Minneapolis, you know, just let it go. Let's let it go to trial. You know, get you an all-white jury. You know, exonerate the police and everybody else, and just hope for the best. Roll the dice. They aggravated. They insulted the United States Supreme Court. The court said, "What are you doing? You don't do that." And the United States Supreme Court, as we move into the last 5 minutes, if you will, of this program, the United States Supreme Court said, man, this has to go to trial. Star Tribune has been sitting on the information, if you will, for a year. We haven't here at MTN. We will stay the course. But for those of you that want to take a look, and I think we'll do an even additional in-depth piece next Tuesday. The family and the son of Terrence Franklin Jr. deserves, as they move towards the October date, they deserve to hear how the powerful institution of a municipality fought this every step of the way. But they got a surprise, because at one point the Franklin family apparently said, look, we will settle. It's been 5 years at that point. We will settle. The city of Minneapolis said, no way. We win this one going away. I mean, that's the way that Susan Siegel and her staff talked to the attorneys, to Michael Patton and others a year and a half ago. They were absolutely shocked when the United States Supreme Court, for whatever the reasons of those 9 justices were, said that this case must go to trial. And so, hopefully, in the case of Terrence Franklin, on October 7th of 2019, his trial will open in the matter of his death and all circumstances that led to it. Again, October 7th. Moved back from a date that had been established 9 months ago, where originally it was supposed to be the 11th or 12th of April. But as we have shared with you, as we begin to close, what the time thing that we have left? That the system said we cannot stand 2 of these trials, which will be dealt with totally different because of the race of the victim and the race of the perpetrator. In one case, black Somalian kills white woman. In the other case, white officers blow the head of a black man, a young black man, off of his shoulders. Can't have 2 cases like that 10, 12, 14, 15 days apart. Let's just push it back 5 months. That's what it is, my friends. So let us never be referred to as that race of people that, because we paid no attention to the pursuit of justice, if you will, we had no idea of the battle that is being waged on our behalf. Let us continue to pray for this nation and for its institutions of justice. And let us never be referred to as that race or group of people that have become extinct because we no longer fight the battle for our salvation and for our freedom. I'm Ron Edwards. This is Black Focus. Yes, it is, man. Yeah.
You didn't mention the gender of the victims either. I bet you that also plays a factor.
What's that?
The fact that she was a young woman instead of a young white man, a pretty white yoga teacher man.
Oh, yeah. Well, we talked about that before here. And talked about it. Everybody knows she's female.
In either event, you will see two radically different trials.
Hey, you're absolutely correct. That's the reason I closed with that in the last 2 minutes.
Yep. No, that's.
Yeah, my brother, it's always good to have documentation.
So we were live streaming and we were doing a local cut. Local cut, we ran out of space.
Did we run out of space?
Well, I think I can clear up